easements, we were talking about a certain proprietary interest. Estoppel, we talked about estoppel as a means by which you can formally acquire certain interests over land when certain formal requirements are not met. But still, now estoppel is a way, so normally what we talked about is how you acquire certain rights and interest over land is through formal meeting up with the formal requirements. Then I said, but at certain times, even though formal requirements are not met, if you are able to bring an estoppel, you are still capable of acquiring certain rights and interests over land. So an estoppel is a way by which you can bypass certain formalities in acquiring certain interests over land. Now we look into adverse possession. Adverse possession can't be even considered being close to estoppel in one way, but it can be understood that adverse possession is also a method an individual can acquire estate over land, ownership over land, without any form of formality at all. Just because I said there's no formality, please don't equate it to proprietary estoppel. Adverse possession is completely a different area of law that in our today's mindset be recognized as a very harsh area of law. Adverse possession is an area of law which enables a mere squatter or a trespasser to go into someone else's land, and as long as this individual meets certain requirements, he is able to acquire good title to that property, kicking away the legal or registered owner out of his own property. Erika, Megan, Vicky, do you understand what I've just said? Yeah. So adverse possession is actually a very, well, one can say a barbaric means of acquiring title to land.
We all need to go and find a, I don't know, a manor house in the sticks somewhere that hasn't been occupied.
Exactly. As long as if you can find an unregistered land, it's going to be very good for you. But if it's a registered land, it's going to make your life even harder. As you will learn, why you will learn a little bit later on, why I said there's a division between registered land and unregistered land. If it's unregistered land, it'll be perfect. You just have to go there and stay for 12 years and it'll be all yours. But if it's not unregistered and if it's registered land, my God, it's better to just be at your own place.
Yeah.
So we'll learn about that also in a little while. So adverse possession. So simply put, now I hope that you have the idea of what adverse possession is. So it enables a mere trespasser. So this area of law is also identified as squatters' rights. So it simply means that a mere squatter, a person who does not have any form of interest over a certain land, go into that land, be in that land for a certain duration of time prescribed by law, and once that is done, the law provides for that person to acquire better title than the registered owner or the legal owner of the property itself. So for your line of studies, adverse possession of registered land, understanding adverse possession of registered land is more than sufficient. However, in getting an understanding about the area of law, we will need to look into the concept that governs adverse possession regardless of being registered or unregistered. So your background will help you understand how registered land differs from the rest in doing so. So, however, regardless of the title being registered or unregistered in nature, there are few things required to be fulfilled for a claim of adverse possession to succeed. So what do I mean by a claim of adverse possession? So what happens here is when an individual finds such or acquires such property and he adversely possesses it for a required period of time, it is said that he has adversely possessed the said property. And this adverse possessor, through its adverse possession of the property, acquires interest over land. In order for that individual to acquire such interests and be recognized as the owner or the title holder, he or she has to bring a successful claim of adverse possession. So yet again, adverse possession, a claim of adverse possession can arise either way. Just as we talked about in estoppel, adverse possession claim can be brought by an individual to acquire title over land, as well as a claim of adverse possession can be brought in as a defense when the legal owner is trying to assert his rights over the land occupied by the adverse possessor. So either way, a claim of adverse possession can arise. And when an adverse possessor is to bring a claim of adverse possession, he has to first fulfill certain requirements laid down by law. It is through these requirements that adverse possession is established and such adverse possessor acquires title of the land that has been adversely possessed. Is that clear, Vicky, Erica, Megan? All right.
Yeah.
So these are the four main requirements that has to be fulfilled. Factual possession, intention to possess, possession is adverse, and possession for a requisite amount of time. Now, under these four elements or four requirements, the first three of them, actual possession, intention to possess, possession being adverse, these three requirements are what we call common law requirements. These requirements are a result of various judicial decisions brought out through time. So these first three requirements are identified as common law requirements. Whereas the time requirement, however, comes through statutory provisions, which we will learn in a little while. However, the first three we have to keep in mind when, regardless of the type of land being adversely possessed, let it be registered land or unregistered land, still, regardless, these three requirements have to be established. Whereas this requirement, when it comes to the fourth requirement, different statutory provisions will apply accordingly to the type, according to the type of land. So separate provisions will deal with registered land and the time requirement of registered land, and unregistered land and the time requirement related to unregistered land. Is that clear? Erica? Morgan?
Yeah.
All right, perfect. So now what we have to do is we'll look through what these 4 requirements are, what are the facts to be considered, what are the main elements in establishing these 4 requirements. We'll have to look through. All right. So factual possession, that is the first one. So an adverse possessor bringing a claim of adverse possession has to prove that he has factual possession over the said property. What is factual possession? Well, factual possession deals with the physical possession or physical elements of adverse possession. That means the so-called adverse possessor has to have physical control over the said property. Now, one might ask, going there into that land and being in that land would amount to physical control. Building a fence around it, putting a padlock on the gate would amount to physical control. Building a house on it would amount to having a certain degree of physical control. But those are very serious elements. What about allowing your animals to graze, or from time to time going in and planting some vegetables? So various acts would render physical control. Then the next thing we have to ask, yes, various things would come out as physical control, but what is the degree of control that you must establish in order to prove that factual possession is there? Well, in the case of Powell versus McFarlane, it was held that the adverse possessor, the alleged possessor, must show to the world at large that he himself is dealing with the property as if he is the actual occupying owner. So looking a third party, a reasonable person, looking at the adverse possessor, doing his day-to-day things over the property. If this reasonable person thinks he must be the legal owner, he must be the owner of this land by the action that he has done, then this possessor has proved that he has the required physical custody and control over the said property. So what is the degree in which factual possession has to be established? It is to prove that the adverse possessor is dealing with the land as an occupying owner might be expected to do. Vicky, is that clear?
Yep.
Erica, Morgan?
Yeah.
So, in order to establish factual possession, sometimes may not be very serious, sometimes may be. However, whether it amounts to factual possession or not is dependent on one crucial factor: how the land can be used. If the land can only be utilized for trivial things, and that person has made sure that he has done all the trivial things that he can simply imagine on that land, still, even though those things are too trivial, still it might amount to adverse possession. But in a normal sense, if it's a property which can be used to do greater things, much more serious things. And in that context, this fellow just rides his horses or parks his car, then of course it would not amount. So first and foremost, in establishing factual possession, the degree would depend on how the land is used. So in the case of Ashmore, you will find that in your supplementary note, it was an adverse possession of certain mooring rights on River Thames. And the use of this plot of riverbed was very restricted. You're not going to go into the river and live in it. No, you're not. It's about how your vessel, your ship, or your boat was docked or moored in it. And when it's during the high tide, the boat was floating. Whereas when it was a low tide, it was resting on the riverbed. So that plot of riverbed was only to be utilized during low tide, and for which the adverse possessor did. When the low tide came, the vessel was resting on the riverbed. So the purpose and the manner it can be used was for that purpose only. Even though it was not continuous, it was utilized. And in the case of Ashmore, it amounted to factual possession. So different degrees are there, and different actions would amount to there being factual possession. In the case of Pye versus Graham, it was locking the gates and putting in livestock to graze. In Graham, in Powell versus McFarlane, it was animals of the adverse possessor grazing on his respective property. In Moran, Buckingham County Council versus Moran, Mr. Moran enclosed the area, put up padlocks, grew crops. So these actions in these cases amounted to factual possession. In the case of tech build, however, there were the adverse possessors' horses were allowed to graze from time to time. The adverse possessors' children played on that land. Now, these were the evidence brought forward in the case of tech build to establish factual possession. However, the court said, in relation to the manner in which the land can be used, is very different from what it was actually used by the adverse possessor. Thus, factual possession was not established in tech build as the actions were very trivial. All right. So that is factual possession. So factual possession simply deals with the physical custody and control that one has over the said property owned by someone else, basically.